There's something uniquely human about wanting control over your own destruction. During the darkest years of the Cold War, both superpowers built machines that could end civilization in minutes, but only one built one that could do it without human permission. They called it Perimeter, but in the West it became known by a simpler, more chilling name, the Dead Hand. It was, on paper, a safeguard, a last resort meant to guarantee retaliation if the Soviet Union were ever destroyed in a nuclear first strike. But in practice, it was something far stranger, an automated system designed to launch the end of the world even after the people who built it were gone. Imagine it. The cities are already ash, the generals are vaporized, the phones are dead. And somewhere, buried deep in the earth, a machine is listening, waiting for a signal that never comes, because the humans who would send it no longer exist. And when the silence lasts too long, it decides on its own. That was the logic of the Dead Hand. The story begins not in Moscow, but in the shadow of panic. In the early 1980s, the Cold War had entered its most dangerous phase since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had built enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over. Both had hair-trigger alert systems that could launch missiles within minutes of detecting an attack. And both had come to fear not just the enemy's intentions, but their own judgment. For the Soviets, that fear was amplified by weakness. The economy was collapsing, communications were primitive, radar systems were aging and unreliable. And after years of espionage and paranoia, Moscow had become obsessed with the possibility of a decapitating strike, a surprise U.S. nuclear attack aimed not at cities, but at command centers, wiping out the leadership before they could respond. The logic was simple and terrifying. If the Americans could destroy the Soviet government in one blow, they could win a nuclear war without suffering retaliation. To the Kremlin, that was unacceptable. And so, in 1983, a small group of engineers and military planners began designing something radical, a system that would make retaliation inevitable. Even if Moscow were obliterated, even if every general were dead, even if the nation ceased to exist, the missiles would still launch. It would guarantee mutually assured destruction, not as a policy, but as a program. The machine would think, listen, and decide for itself. It wasn't artificial intelligence in the modern sense. It didn't reason. It didn't plan. It didn't know what it was doing. But it could sense. The system was built on a simple, brutal logic. Monitor the signs of life, and if life disappears, assume the worst. Deep inside a network of underground bunkers, the Soviets built command posts shielded by hundreds of meters of concrete and rock. These facilities were designed to survive direct nuclear hits. Within them were sensors, seismic detectors to sense ground tremors from explosions, radiation monitors to detect fallout, radio receivers to listen for the last human commands. The system constantly measured the pulse of the country, radio chatter, military frequencies, even atmospheric pressure. As long as there was noise, the machine stayed silent. But if the noise stopped, if Moscow went dark, the command center stopped transmitting, and the world above turned to static, Perimeter would wake up. Its purpose wasn't to prevent war. It was to finish it. The process was chillingly mechanical. Once triggered, Perimeter would activate a special series of command rockets, missiles with no warheads, carrying only transmitters. As they arced over Soviet territory, they would beam launch orders to the country's surviving nuclear silos, submarines, and mobile launchers. Those units, pre-programmed to respond, would then unleash the full Soviet arsenal automatically. No phone calls, no confirmation, no forgiveness. The system's designers saw it as the ultimate insurance policy. The West might destroy the Soviet Union, but it would never survive the victory. The fear of that certainty, they believed, would keep both sides in check. It was deterrence elevated to theology. The men who built it were not villains. They were patriots working within the logic of their time, a logic that said safety was found not in peace, but in parity. If your enemy could strike, you must ensure that you can strike back. The difference with Perimeter was that it removed the one weak link in that chain, the human being. Because humans, the Kremlin feared, might hesitate, they might falter, they might die before pushing the button. The West, of course, knew nothing of this. Perimeter was so secret that even within the Soviet military, few people were aware of its existence. The project was overseen by a small group under the Strategic Rocket Forces, reporting directly to the highest levels of the Politburo. It was hidden not just from the Americans, but from their own people. Even today, much of it remains classified. But fragments of its design have emerged through interviews, documents, and the confessions of men who once held the world's deadliest secret. They describe it not as a weapon, but as an organism. It had a heartbeat, the rhythm of constant surveillance, a pulse of signals passing through cables and antennas, ensuring the system stayed awake but dormant. It had reflexes, coded triggers that would respond automatically to specific conditions. And, most unsettlingly, it had judgment, a final stage of human input before the machine made its decision. In theory, Perimeter couldn't launch on its own. It needed a final authorization, a human officer buried deep underground, tasked with entering the last command if all else failed. But that officer's orders were absolute, and his isolation complete. He wouldn't have a phone line to Moscow. He wouldn't know if the city still stood. He would only know what the system told him, that communication was lost, radiation levels were high, seismic activity was consistent with nuclear strikes, and the homeland was silent. In that silence, he would make the final choice for all humanity. In training, they called it the dead man's command. What makes the dead hand uniquely terrifying is not just that it existed, but that it made sense. Within the logic of deterrence, it was perfectly rational. After all, if both sides were armed with first strike capabilities, and both feared losing their ability to retaliate, then the only way to guarantee peace was to guarantee mutual destruction no matter what. It was the ultimate paradox. To prevent Armageddon, you had to build it. Western analysts suspected the Soviets had some form of failed deadly mechanism, but no one imagined the scale or sophistication of Perimeter. American early warning systems were designed to detect incoming missiles, but they still relied on human decision-making. The U.S. believed that removing people from the process would be insane. The Soviets believed that leaving them in was worse. Their fear wasn't just of attack, it was of confusion. In 1983, the year Perimeter was activated, the world came closer to nuclear war than most people realized. That September, Soviet radar falsely detected an incoming American missile strike. A lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov was the officer on duty. The protocol said he should report the alert and allow the command to retaliate immediately. But Petrov hesitated. He trusted his instincts, and decided the signal was an error. He was right. Had he followed orders, the world might have ended that night. To the architects of Perimeter, that incident proved their point. What if Petrov had died in the first blast? What if no one had been there to decide? What if America's strike really had been real? Their answer was a machine that wouldn't need to guess. But what they didn't realize was that by removing the human factor, they had also removed mercy. The human element, flawed, emotional, irrational, was also the only thing standing between tension and annihilation. A machine can't doubt itself. It can't forgive. It can't hear a false alarm and decide to wait. It just executes. In interviews after the Cold War, one of Perimeter's engineers was asked how he felt about what he'd built. He paused, then said softly, "It worked." That was the problem. He meant that the system had performed flawlessly in every test, that the command rockets launched, the communication links responded, the silos received their signals. The dead hand didn't glitch. It did exactly what it was designed to do, destroy everything when everything else was already gone. But in its success lay a kind of existential despair. Perimeter wasn't just a machine, it was a monument to hopelessness, a structure built on the assumption that one day everyone would fail. And yet, paradoxically, it may have saved the world. The Americans, once they learned of its existence after the Soviet collapse, were horrified. But they also recognized the grim logic. A system like the dead hand ensured that no U.S. president could ever believe in a winnable nuclear war. It guaranteed that even a perfect first strike would lead to mutual extinction. It was deterrence stripped to its bones, brutal, automatic, inescapable. The tragedy of the Cold War is that so much genius was spent perfecting fear. Scientists who could have cured diseases built missile guidance systems. Mathematicians who could have explored the stars wrote algorithms for destruction. Every invention was a reflection of what the other side might already be doing. And out of that feedback loop of paranoia came a machine designed to think for itself, not because humanity wanted progress, but because it no longer trusted itself to survive its own mistakes. That was the secret heartbeat of the nuclear age. Above ground, the Soviet people lived ordinary lives, shopping for bread, raising children, working in factories, unaware that miles below them, a computer waited to decide the fate of the species. And perhaps that was the strangest part of all, that this monstrous system existed not in defiance of humanity, but in its service. It was built to protect, not destroy. It was an act of love warped by fear, a promise that no one would ever attack the motherland without paying the ultimate price. In a twisted way, Perimeter was the most faithful soldier the Soviet Union ever had. It would never surrender, never sleep, never die. It would stand guard forever, long after the nation it served had turned to dust. The dead hand didn't live in a single place. It was a network of places, an invisible skeleton running through the Soviet landscape. Some were bunkers hidden under mountains. Others were hardened silos disguised as hills or snow-covered warehouses. Each was connected by redundant communication lines that snaked through the soil like veins, linking the heart of Moscow to the farthest edge of Siberia. The system's brain sat somewhere deep below the surface in a command post called Kovinsky Mountain, a fortress hollowed out of granite and reinforced to withstand even direct nuclear impacts. Its walls were lined with copper cables, its corridors humming with electronics, and its air filtered by machines that could operate for months without sunlight. It was, in every sense, a cathedral to deterrence, a temple built for the worship of survival through annihilation. When the order to activate Perimeter was given, usually during moments of heightened tension, the bunker sealed itself off from the world above. Thick blast doors closed, communications switched to secure frequencies, and the operators inside became ghosts, disconnected from their families, their cities, and even their superiors. For them, the war had already begun in theory. Activation didn't mean the missiles were about to fly. It meant the machine was listening. It meant that if Moscow stopped speaking, if the satellites stopped transmitting, if the world went dark, Perimeter would hear the silence and interpret it as death. It's difficult to overstate how precarious that balance was. The entire concept rested on trust. Trust in sensors, in algorithms, in buried wires stretched across a continent. Trust that the absence of information meant catastrophe, and that catastrophe deserved revenge. And yet, that very logic may have prevented nuclear war. In 1983, the same year Perimeter reportedly went operational, the world experienced one of its most dangerous misunderstandings. NATO launched a massive exercise called Able Archer 83, simulating the process of escalating from conventional war to nuclear release. The exercise was so realistic, complete with encrypted communications, mock launch codes, and the participation of heads of state, that Soviet intelligence mistook it for a genuine first strike. Kremlin analysts believed the U.S. might use the exercise as cover for a surprise attack. Soviet nuclear forces went on full alert. Bomber pilots sat in cockpits with engines running. Submarines prepared to dive. Missile crews awaited launch orders. For several days, the world balanced on a wire thinner than radio static. If communications between Moscow and its outposts had broken down, Perimeter might have been armed. If a single false alarm had convinced its operators that the leadership was dead, the system could have done what it was built to do. It's impossible to know how close that came to happening. What's clear is that Perimeter was more than a machine. It was a philosophy, one that redefined what it meant to hold power. For centuries, nations had drawn their strength from armies and borders. The Soviets, in their final decades, found strength in inevitability. To them, the greatest vulnerability of any deterrent system was humanity itself. Humans could panic, freeze, make mistakes. Machines could not. That difference became the moral justification for Perimeter. It wasn't designed to make war easier. It was designed to make peace unavoidable. If neither side could strike without dying, then both would live forever in tension, and therefore in peace. But peace built on automation is just a slower kind of war. The men stationed at Kaczynski and other command centers lived under immense psychological pressure. They were trained to think of themselves not as soldiers, but as custodians of civilization's final heartbeat. Every shift began with routine checks, monitoring seismic sensors, testing radio channels, calibrating radiation detectors. They watched for anomalies the way doctors watch a patient's vital signs. Too much noise meant false alarms. Too much silence meant extinction. They joked, sometimes darkly, that they were the pulse keepers. And above them, the country they served was falling apart. The Soviet Union of the 1980s was rotting from within, its economy stagnating, its leadership aging, its ideology fraying. Yet its nuclear arsenal was stronger than ever. By 1985, the USSR had nearly 40,000 warheads, each one capable of turning a city to glass. The more fragile the state became, the more it relied on those weapons to project strength. In that context, perimeter was both a comfort and a curse. It reassured the Politburo that no enemy could ever disarm them completely, but it also symbolized their own helplessness. They had built a world-ending system because they no longer trusted themselves to survive one. And still, despite the secrecy, rumors of such a system leaked to Western intelligence. U.S. analysts had long speculated that the Soviets possessed some form of failed deadly retaliation plan, but they underestimated its scope. The existence of perimeter wasn't confirmed in the West until the early 1990s, when a Russian general finally admitted its reality in an interview. "It exists," he said, "and it is still functioning." That revelation sent a chill through NATO's command structures. By then, the Soviet Union was gone, but its weapons and its systems remained. Who, exactly, controlled perimeter now? Could it still be triggered? Would anyone even know how to shut it down? The frightening truth is that perimeter was designed to outlive governments. It was built to be self-sustaining, to require only minimal maintenance, to wait indefinitely. The system didn't care who ruled Moscow. Its duty was eternal. In interviews with Russian military analysts decades later, they described how perimeter continued to evolve after the USSR's collapse. The newer versions were updated, integrated with modern sensors and satellite networks, rebranded under new code names. Officially, the system was decommissioned. Unofficially, it was modernized. Even now, Russian officials refuse to confirm or deny its operational status. When pressed, one general smiled and said, "We do not discuss angels of death." The phrase stuck. It's easy to imagine perimeter as a relic, a leftover from a time of paranoia. But in truth, its logic has never gone away. Modern nuclear command systems, both Russian and American, rely heavily on automation. Computerized early warning systems, satellite surveillance, and AI-assisted decision-making all serve the same purpose: to compress the time between detection and response. The faster the threat, the faster the reaction must be. And the faster the reaction, the smaller the role for human hesitation. In that sense, the world has never stopped building new versions of the dead hand. Today, algorithms scan radar data, classify missile trajectories, and even draft launch recommendations faster than any human could. The human in the loop often has mere minutes to decide. In theory, these systems make us safer by reducing error. In practice, they make us fragile, because the faster machines react, the less room there is for doubt. Doubt, ironically, is what saved the world in 1983, when Stanislav Petrov refused to trust the machine. Without his doubt, without his refusal, the Cold War might have ended in fire. The men who built perimeter saw that hesitation as weakness. They believed a world-ending machine would make war unthinkable. But it also made survival a matter of faith. Faith in circuits, code, and silence. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, much of its infrastructure was scavenged or abandoned. Bunkers flooded, power lines decayed, but the command structure that supported perimeter survived in fragments. Russian engineers, aware of what might happen if the system degraded incorrectly, maintained parts of it quietly through the 1990s. Even as the economy imploded, technicians still received paychecks, sometimes months late, to keep the safeguard running. They didn't do it for ideology. They did it because they didn't know what would happen if they stopped. One technician, interviewed years later, described his experience. "You don't turn off God," he said. You just stop visiting the church. By the time Vladimir Putin rose to power, Perimeter had become legend, half myth, half deterrent. Its existence was both denied and implied, a ghost haunting the global balance of power. Western analysts referred to it as a dead-hand deterrent, an insurance policy for apocalypse. Russian officials, when asked, would smile and change the subject. The ambiguity was part of its power. If your enemies don't know whether the machine still lives, they'll never risk finding out. What makes this story so haunting isn't that the dead hand once existed, it's that we don't know if it ever truly died. The command rockets, the relay systems, the launch silos, they can be rebuilt, rewired, replaced. The philosophy behind them doesn't need maintenance. It just needs fear. The same fear that built it still runs quietly through the veins of global security. Every modern missile, every alert protocol, every early warning satellite carries a trace of that old paranoia. The dream of total control remains alive. So does the illusion that if we automate destruction enough, it will somehow become safer. But machines don't care about safety. They care about instructions. That's the paradox. The dead hand left behind, a world where humanity's greatest act of self-defense was to build something that could kill it automatically. A world where silence could mean extinction. The strangest thing about the dead hand is that it worked. It did exactly what it was built to do. Nothing. For nearly 4 decades, it has sat dormant, humming quietly beneath layers of concrete, waiting for a catastrophe that never came. In that sense, it's the most successful weapon ever made, one that prevented itself from being used. But beneath that success is something darker, the realization that our survival depends not on wisdom, but on luck. The world didn't endure because people became kinder or saner. It endured because the machines didn't mishear each other. Even today, the system's core philosophy remains alive in the modern world, hidden in the logic of automation, in the blind faith we place in code. In the 21st century, the same mentality that birthed Perimeter has spread beyond bunkers and missiles. It lives in financial algorithms that move faster than their creators can comprehend. It lives in autonomous drones that identify enemies by pattern, not judgment. It lives in the data centers that monitor global communication for threats that might not exist. The line between watchdog and executioner has always been thin. Perimeter simply erased it. After the Cold War ended, Western journalists sought out the men who had built it. Many were old, retired, their faces pale under the light of kitchen lamps as they tried to explain what it felt like to build something that might have killed everyone. Most didn't think of it that way. "We built a shield," one said, "not a sword. But a shield that triggers itself becomes both." One engineer described visiting the control room years later. Dust covered the consoles. The lights still flickered. The same steel chairs remained in place, perfectly aligned. It looked, he said, like the war had already happened. That, perhaps, is the dead hand's most haunting legacy. Not that it could have ended the world, but that it taught us to live as if it already had. The system turned annihilation into a background process, something managed, measured, automated. It removed the apocalypse from politics and placed it into engineering. As long as the circuits worked, the world would stay balanced. As long as the lights stayed on, the machine would sleep. But machines don't sleep forever. They wait. And as technology evolved, the dream of removing human error from war only deepened. During the 2000s, militaries across the world began experimenting with autonomous defense systems, computers capable of detecting, targeting, and firing on incoming threats without waiting for a human command. They were justified as safeguards against hypersonic missiles, as tools for survival in the age of seconds. But the principle was the same as Perimeter's: replace hesitation with automation. Each innovation made the trigger shorter, the reaction faster, the human role smaller. The irony, of course, is that hesitation, that fragile pause between impulse and action, is the last human defense against catastrophe. Every time we build systems that skip that pause, we come closer to the dead hand's dream, a world that no longer needs people to end itself. In modern Russia, the official story is that Perimeter has been deactivated. Yet military analysts continue to find references to its successor systems in budget documents, satellite images, and technical manuals. In 2018, a Russian general told a state television program, "Perimeter is alive and well." When asked if it still had the power to retaliate automatically, he smiled. "It does what it was built to do." And what it was built to do was wait. The question no one can answer is whether the system has been fully integrated into Russia's newer digital command networks, the ones now assisted by machine learning and real-time data from satellites and radars. If it has, then humanity's longest-standing doomsday machine may also be its oldest AI. That possibility forces a new kind of reckoning. The dead hand wasn't a fluke of Soviet paranoia. It was a logical endpoint, the moment when fear became self-sustaining. In trying to eliminate uncertainty, the Soviets created a machine that turned uncertainty into extinction. And we're still doing it, just in quieter ways. Every automated trading algorithm, every self-correcting military defense system, every global network that promises fail-safe precision, all of them are built on the same illusion, that perfect systems make perfect safety. But the truth the dead hand revealed is the opposite. The more tightly we engineer control, the more fragile it becomes. Because when everything depends on signals and sensors, a single silence can end the world. That silence nearly came several times. In 1995, 4 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russian early warning systems detected what appeared to be an incoming U.S. missile launched from Norway. The alert reached President Boris Yeltsin himself. For the first time in history, the Russian nuclear briefcase, the Chejid, was opened in response to a false alarm. Yeltsin had minutes to decide whether to retaliate. His generals urged caution. The missile, they realized, was part of a civilian weather experiment, but the fact that the chain of command worked, that it still existed at all, proved that Perimeter's logic had survived the fall of communism. It had become a fixture of the global nervous system. That's what makes the dead hand more than a relic. It's a prophecy, a mirror of the world we've built since, one where systems too complex for any single person to understand still hold our fate. A world where automation, justified by safety, edges closer to autonomy every year. When you look back at the engineers who designed it, they don't resemble villains. They resemble us. They were scientists, programmers, optimists. They believed technology could stabilize chaos. They believed their creation was rational. And in a sense, it was. The system made war less likely, but it also made the consequences of error absolute. There's a line from a declassified briefing written during Perimeter's development. To remove the possibility of hesitation is to remove the possibility of mercy. That's the price of automation, not efficiency, but empathy. As artificial intelligence continues to integrate into modern warfare, from autonomous drones to predictive defense algorithms, the lessons of the dead hand feel less like history and more like a warning label we've chosen to ignore. The same principles of redundancy, decision compression, and automatic retaliation now underpin digital security systems, cyber weapons, and even nuclear command updates. We keep telling ourselves that automation prevents disaster. But every line of code that replaces human judgment brings us one step closer to the same precipice the Soviets reached in 1983, the point where silence itself becomes the trigger. And perhaps that's what makes the dead hand the purest expression of the Cold War, not its bombs, not its politics, but its faith in systems. A belief that order can be programmed, that survival can be guaranteed through machines. It's the same faith that drives us today, in markets, in AI, in digital governance. The faces and tools have changed. The arrogance hasn't. If Perimeter still sleeps beneath the Russian soil, it is less a weapon than a monument to the moment humanity built something it could not fully control, and then decided that was good enough. The old Soviet engineers used to joke that the system would outlive them all. They were right. Many of them are gone. The machine remains. Whether it's plugged in or not no longer matters. The idea it represents, that safety comes from surrendering decision to the inhuman, has already escaped its bunkers. And so the world continues, humming with silent watchers, automated guardians, and algorithms that listen for threats that may never come. Somewhere perhaps in a forgotten mountain, a red light still flickers in the dark, waiting for the signal that the world has ended. It listens, it waits, it never sleeps. Because the dead hand doesn't need to destroy the world to win. It just needs to remind us that, once upon a time, we trusted machines with our survival and called it peace. The dead hand, the Soviet machine that could end the world. The day we taught a computer how to keep a promise no one should ever have made.